Welcome to Rooted and Rising, addressing inequities and transforming higher ed. Bold conversations for change. In this podcast, we'll delve into the deep, difficult, and dynamic questions of inequity and the transformational leadership required in today's college landscape. I'm your host, Jill Provo, Vice President, Equity and International here at NSCC. Thank you for joining me in this second episode of the podcast series. In this season, you're going to get to know the Equity and International Leadership team, our stories, our strategies, and the road ahead, because I really want you to get to know the senior leaders in this department and hear more about the great work that they're leading. In this episode, From Recognition to Reparations, we're going to focus on the African Nova Scotian experience. This podcast is going to be about truth-telling, it's going to be about accountability, and really help us understand what it means to ensure that we're putting in place reparations that are not just symbolic, but are systemic. I'm happy to be joined today by Shawn Smith, Senior Advisor, Black and African Nova Scotian Initiatives here at the college, whose leadership and whose lived experience is helping us to create a more inclusive and just college system. I do want to say it's important and appropriate that we would focus this second podcast on the African Nova Scotian experience. That is intentional because here at NSCC, we do have a priority focus on the Mi'kmaq and historic African Nova Scotian communities, given the historically disproportionately marginalized experiences they face. Shawn, welcome. This conversation is close to my heart. For our listeners to know, I started my journey here at NSCC about 20 years ago, starting up the first Afrocentric learning program in the country. Shout out to the Afrocentric learning option as it's now known. So this conversation is really close to my heart. Shawn, let's get to know you a little bit. Tell us about yourself, what guides your work here at NSCC, your connection to the African Nova Scotian experience. What do you want our listeners to know?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the Rooted to Rises podcast. It's really important that we continue to have unconventional ways to communicate some of the amazing work that we're doing here. And kudos to you, Jill, for some of the work that you've been doing here over the last 20 years. I didn't realize it was that long, but great.
Thank you.
It's great to be able to share space with you and have this conversation as well, too. And I know that my colleague Denise was before me as well too, and I listened to her episode, and I thought it really did. It was a great episode, and it was a way to build some context in terms of continuing on with the conversation that we're about to have as well today. So, thank you.
Yes.
So to get started, a little bit about me. I guess the best place to start is, essentially where I'm from. And when I look at that, when I talk about where I'm from, I talk about the historical African Nova Scotian community of Yarmouth. But it's a little bit deeper than that for me as well, too, because I grew up in a household where I heard a lot of stories. So my history was passed down my household to me from both my father and my mother. So I can actually trace my ancestry back to the Black Loyalists on my father's side, who arrived here in 1783. And on my mother's side, the Black refugees who arrived here in 1816. And believe it or not, they ended up going to the Preston Township. So it's interesting for me is that I always ground myself in the historical communities in that sense. So typically what I say when I meet individuals is that I'm 8th generation African Nova Scotian. So I know that carries a lot of history, responsibility, and pride as well, too. I love the question about what guides my work. And you mentioned at the beginning about truth telling, but I also always share stories as I find that's an effective way to communicate and just be relational with everyone as well too, in terms of my communication style. So what guides my work is I think about my grandmother, believe it or not, because my grandmother was one of those individuals here in Nova Scotia at that time that had the option to attend a segregated school or go to work. And so I think about my grandmother's kind of educational experience in that sense. And for me personally, I think about how am I helping improve the current African Nova Scotian accessibility and options for education in that sense. And fast forward right now, what's really important for me as well too is thinking about my daughters and what we're leaving behind in that sense as well too. So are we improving these systems that my daughters or the next generations moving into? And those are that's what kind of guides my work in that sense. I know it's not going to be perfect, but it's about progression and making sure that we're moving forward in the right direction.
Thank you, Shawn. Sometimes it's hard for us, I know, to trace our ancestry. I know for me, at least a fifth generation African Nova Scotian on my father's side, also the Black Loyalists. So nice connection there. And do you know, well, you would know, but for our listeners, I tell people my children's father attended a segregated school in Nova Scotia. The last one that closed in Lincolnville was, I believe, 1983, Shawn. And that's not that long ago. So just a reality for how current that is.
No, it's not that long ago. And I was 1 year old, if you want some additional context,
Wow.
right? So it's really important to think about that. And Nova Scotia was home to several segregated schools across the province, right? And, close to where I grew up in Yarmouth, there was a segregated school in Greenville as well, too. So it's one of those important parts of our history that's not necessarily looked after, but also the I guess the important thing about those segregated schools at the end of the day as well too is that our community was learning from other individuals in our own community as well too. So they
Mm-hmm.
were kind of beacons of hope and brought community together. And a lot of those segregated schools were in the churches, of course, and
Mm-hmm.
in these communities. So it's really interesting in that sense.
Yes, agreed. Thank you, Shawn. I also know, I don't know if Shawn, you agree, but I see you as a podcaster extraordinaire yourself. You do host a successful podcast that I would love for you to share with listeners so they can check it out after today's podcast because it is quite educational. So would you like to give a shout out to your podcast?
I guess it depends on how you define success. I think one of the interesting things about podcasting is just doing it, right? So I applaud you for doing it and taking that step for anybody to get in front of a camera. And this is my first time really being on a camera. I usually do the audio format, but it's interesting because podcasting isn't easy to do. There's a lot of planning that's required. And I know you've done a lot of work with regards to that as well, too. But I guess it's successful in the sense that it's been out since November 1st or November 2021. I think I've released over 30 episodes. And the name of the podcast is the Loyalist Connections Podcast. And you can find that on all major platforms that you listen to your podcasts on. For me, I would say also, too, it's important to think about the podcast in the sense as another preservation tool. But
Mm-hmm.
it's also honoring our oral history and our storytelling that comes from our communities. And Jill, you and I both know, being around the kitchen table, the amount of knowledge that's shared. So that's kind of the way I approach my podcasting as well, too. So it's been
Yes.
a journey for myself in terms of learning, on learning, and also honoring the people who have shaped this province, and specifically the African Nova Scotian community in that sense.
Thank you, Shawn. Loyalist Connections. Check it out. Shawn, let's dig into our topic for today, and we'll talk about each of these concepts separately in a moment. But the title is From Recognition to Reparations. So that's a deep one. Let's just dig in a little bit. What does that mean to you, kind of personally and professionally, and how does it fit in your vision for Black inclusion at NSCC?
So I remember you asking me about the title, and I thought about it, and I'm like, what do we and I'm not speaking personally and professionally, but also thinking about our broader community in that sense. What do we need? Because a lot of the times we have conversations around equity, things of that nature. But I go back to the International Decade for People of African Descent, and there's a specific segment in that report that talks about reparations. And I think it's interesting when we start talking about reparations, we need to be recognized first. And what does that actually look like in that context? And for me, what I would say is that I kind of ground myself, and I'll share a story for our listeners here, but being African Nova Scotian is unique to any other place across Canada, and I would say more broadly in North America. If you're African Nova Scotian, you typically would encounter this in your life, that question where you run into somebody and they ask you, where are you from? And then you look at them and you're like, I'm from Nova Scotia. And then they ask you the next question is, but really, where are you from? And so that's the recognition piece for me. I often say that African Nova Scotians continue to always kind of fight for their identity, to be recognized first. if you can't recognize somebody first, you can't even have that conversation around reparations or how to repair trust in the community. So I often say to like African Nova Scotian identity is fluid. We know it's not monolithic. We have all these 52 historical communities, but that's the one common thing in terms of us trying to be recognized as something. It tells us about how our identity is questioned at times, or it's slowly being erased, which we can sometimes see. So that's the recognition piece, really, for me in that sense.
Yes, well said, Shawn. And how does that recognition piece really show up? Because that obviously is the first step. How does that show up kind of in a college context?
Yeah, so I think you also talked about Black inclusion. And what does that actually look like, right? And I think that means really grounding ourselves in the histories of our communities here, right? So I often, and I know if Denise was here, she'd probably give me a little kick here because I didn't mention this at the beginning, but thinking about where we're at as well too, because we're in Mi'kma'ki and we are 52 African Nova Scotian communities, but we're surrounded by Mi'kmaq communities. And we have to have this conversation about us being treaty beneficiaries as well too. And so it's us grounding ourselves in that unique historical knowledge and even how those two communities have lived together as well and worked together in that sense. So inclusion for us, it's not necessarily about being symbolic in that sense. So I love African Nova Scotian recognitions, that's great, but it's moving the bar forward in that sense for us as well too. What does that look like? So that's about transforming curriculum, increasing student supports, but also reimagining that and what that looks like as well too. And really importantly, the campus culture for our Black learners more broadly. Is when you show up in these spaces, is it a space where you feel like you are able to learn, but also feeling that your identity is reflected in these spaces in a meaningful way? And that's ongoing work. Nobody's expecting that to happen overnight specifically. It does take time to build that collaboration with community and more broadly our learners, our Black learners in that sense. So one of the things around recognition is that I had the question the other day about how do you balance Afrocentric education with African Nova Scotian history? And I really appreciated that question. I thought it was fascinating in that sense. But one of the things I pointed out is that African Nova Scotian history is Afrocentric in that sense, right? And back to the recognition piece, why do we do an African Nova Scotian recognition? Well, it grounds us. And so I think recognition really starts with telling our truth about our presence and how we arrived here, but also making that visible on campus as well too. So one of the things I think about, and to give a specific example, is specifically related to the number 2 construction battalion and the national apology. There was a number of recommendations that came out of the number 2 construction battalion apology. And one of those recommendations was to have symbols or monuments or things of that nature to give kind of definitive place and space to the individuals that were there before. So for me, in a perfect world, I would love to, which I know not everything's ideal, but coming onto a campus, there would be an African Nova Scotian recognition. Somehow, maybe it's a plaque or a monument of the surrounding communities around there. And I think that will give some context to individuals arriving on campus to make sure that our history is not erased, that it's preserved, and that it grounds everybody when you first step onto these campuses.
Thank you, Shawn. That's a great example. And, for our listeners to know, it will be a future episode, but I know you and some of the colleagues in our department are working on strategy. So there is an African Nova Scotian strategy in play. And I know, Shawn, you have some great ideas and some goals that will come to life through that work as well.
Absolutely. Yes.
So let's transition then to the reparations side of things. When you think about reparations, how could and should that show up in the college or post-secondary context?
Yeah, I went big with the title.
Right.
And I say that in all seriousness because, when individuals hear reparations, I think financial compensation immediately comes to mind. And what I want to do is for listeners to just take a step back and think about the actual word reparation and what that means. And that's to repair. And that's also repairing any wrongdoings, but also repairing trust and building relationships within communities as well too as we move forward. So I think that's one of the most important things to think about. I will give NSCC a pat on the back. I think we're doing a really good job in terms of looking at specifically like financial aids awards dedicated to African, Nova Scotian, and Black learners. And since my time at being at the college here, I've seen that increase. And I think that's a tangible an example of reparations in that sense. Financial aids awards and bursaries are a great place to start with that. The other thing that I can talk about as well too, and we've been just part of this initiative as well too, is that having dedicated spaces on campus for individuals. So we're starting to move towards Afrocentric spaces on campus as well too. Now that is something that is very, in terms of repairing uh, more broadly, trust within community as well too, for individuals knowing that, hey, when an individual from the African Nova Scotian community needs a place to go, there's a place for them to be able to go, and they feel like they have an element of cultural safety there. So I think it's really important that we highlight that we're moving forward, and that's a dedicated, I would say in my mind, a reparation, an example of reparation as well too. The good thing about those Afrocentric spaces, they're also a recruitment and retention tool when you go out to community as well too. So you have conversations with community about these spaces and how they can create a really safe learning environment for some of our learners as well too from our communities. So the other thing I would also say as well too is obviously programming comes to mind. Having a dedicated African Nova Scotian African Nova Scotian course or curriculum that's reflective of our communities is really important to have. Whether that's students taking that when they start here at NSCC, but to have them grounded in that sense, to have an understanding of the African Nova Scotian experience here as well too. The other thing too that we're doing well here is, you see my theme here, I picked examples of some of the works that we are already doing in that sense. That doesn't mean it stops, but these are really concrete examples of some of the reparation pieces that are happening here right now, is the Fruits of the Labor program. And I think if you look at the Fruits of the Labor program, the collaboration between, the Boys and Girls Club of Greater Dartmouth, NSCC, and other community partners in that sense, but the initiative from a youth perspective to get youth involved earlier and often is part of reparations as well too, and providing them access to places like the campus here, but to give them also culinary skills at a very young age to think about what potential pathways that could lead to as well too. So those are kind of the things that I think of in terms of reparations. I would also add too that we're doing some other really good work in terms of applied innovation and research as well too. I know that we're working with some communities on like water solutions and things of that nature. Those are things that can really impact the community outside per se, and have an impact with kind of making sure that the African Nova Scotian communities continue to thrive.
Thank you, Shawn. You're making me think, one of the things we're fortunate about, we all know we have work to do here at NSCC, but we do have many great partners across the college, and I do look forward to probably featuring some of those great partners in future episodes as well. So thank you for sharing some of those very tangible examples.
Yes. Yeah, I didn't mean to put applied innovation and research on, but it's
No, it's
something
good.
that I just think the relationship there slowly but surely, and this is like the collaboration piece, I think we're starting to get there. Yeah.
Yes. We say all the time, don't we, Shawn? We can't do this work alone. It's not ours to lead on our own. So
No,
really love the fact that we have some great and willing partners across the college.
absolutely.
Let's maybe just kind of switch gears a little bit and just talk about leadership for a moment. I'm interested in talking to this about you because you and I, you are the most senior African Nova Scotian male leader at the college. I am obviously a biracial woman with the privilege of sitting around the executive table, and we know there are sometimes maybe tensions in equity work around when do you celebrate, there's still struggle. And I think from a leadership perspective in particular, I'm not sure if everybody realizes it, but I do feel sometimes there's an additional pressure that we can feel, not just because of the expectations of the organization we work for, but also from the communities we're part of. So we just love your thoughts on that and how you manage that duality.
Yeah, when you sent me that question, it was a great question. I don't think I manage it well. I think it's a balance.
Yes,
And
balance.
if I could be completely vulnerable about that, it's one of those things that's really challenging. And maybe I was a little bit I don't want to say naive when I first entered into this role, because you go into it with good intentions. You just want to help your community and have an impact. So you don't sometimes think about those things as well too. And it's important for you to, I appreciate that you acknowledge that, because there is extra weight.
Yes.
And oftentimes I've heard also too, like, it's my role is also, it's the duality in that sense is that, I have a strong connection with community in that sense. So I actively talk to community on a regular basis in that sense. And our community is broad, right? So one of the things I think about is there's a quote by Billie Jean King. If you know who Billie Jean King is, she's one of the greatest professional tennis players uh, in history, but pressure is a privilege. And that is really where I'm at with it. I've kind of came to terms with that. Like, pressure is a privilege, and what I'm doing, there's a reason why I'm in this role. But a huge part of the reason is because you hired me as well too, so I recognize that. But it is a privilege, and when you start looking at that, at the end of the day, there is going to be a little bit of extra weight on your shoulders. It's important for you to figure out how you put some boundaries and parameters around that. I would say. So it's interesting for me. It's like, and I've shared this before with you, and this wouldn't be unique in that sense, because we have other individuals from our community working at the college. But when you step outside the door, it doesn't stop for you. Community will still sees you as NSCC, and you're the bridge to NSCC. So it's trying to find those boundaries, and some of that stuff is realizing that you can't control all of that
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the day. I think we're in positions for a reason here, and at the end of the day, I try to just take it with a grain of salt, make sure that I'm grounding myself, and having spaces to kind of decompress with regards to some of the day-to-day stuff, because it is a lot of weight that we carry, but it's privilege at the end of the day. And I think it's also, um, I'm privileged enough to be in this position to try to impact our community.
That's a great framing, Shawn. I'm going to do my own reflecting on that myself. Privilege, pressure is privilege.
Yep.
That is really a great way to look at it. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, no
Um,
problem.
Shawn, I'm going to maybe combine our last couple of questions as we get ready to wrap here. Maybe as people are listening to this and learning or unlearning, as we sometimes say, what responsibilities do they carry once they better understand anti-Black racism? And what advice do you have for people who want to be allies or accomplices, was the word Denise used in our last podcast. So love your thoughts on that, and just any other final things you'd like listeners to carry with them.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I saw that, and so I kind of frame it like this. Like, first of all, in terms of learning, at the end of the day, it's lifelong learning. It's continuous. Um, Especially when you're doing anti-racist learning, you're unpacking and learning things constantly all the time. So it's not necessarily a straight line, right? And I think one of the things that happens in terms of allyship is that people get on and off the allyship bus, as I will call it right now. So, and I'll give you a really good example. Allies showed up during the George Floyd movement. People were showing up. That was 5 years ago. And then things have shifted. So where's the allyship now? And so one of the things that I continue to say is that it's easy to show up in those movements, but it's not easy to show up when those movements aren't happening. The day-to-day stuff, the systemic racism, or when you're part of a conversation and something comes up that's a little bit gritty and in a conversation that is a place for you to speak up. Are you speaking up? So there's also risk for allies as well too, because they're going against the status quo. And not to get into a lot of terminology, but the white solidarity and white social capital that we've talked about, when you're going against the grain in that sense, there's risk for allies as well too.
Yes.
But in order to get to that place where you become an accomplice, you're going to have to take some risk in that sense. What I think about allyship in that sense is it's great to show up in those tough moments, and that can be during African Heritage Month. But what are you doing all those other 11 months of the year as well too? And if you do want to participate in African Heritage Month, well, are you doing some of the lifting? I'm often very mindful that, our communities have been doing a lot of the lifting for a number of years. Allyship should be kind of mending some of that and taking some of the load off of us, so to speak, so that they're doing some of the work. And I just think about something earlier on we said in this conversation about collective work and collective responsibility, Ujima. We need that, right? And that doesn't just that extends to our community, the African Nova Scotian community, but more broadly, other communities to do some of the heavy lifting and some of the work as well too, because we know that the emotional labor that and toll that takes on us. So
Yes.
I do think that, allyship is going to look different to different people, but the key thing is showing up kind of 24/7 and being there to support more broadly the African Nova Scotian and the Black community in that sense.
Yeah, I think that's so wise. This idea that, to our listeners, we need you in every moment, not just in the movement. I think that's really important for people to hear.
Yes.
Any final thoughts, Shawn?
Oh, I have lots of thoughts. I mean, God, I'm not short for words. I mean, sometimes I can get a little long-winded. The one thing I would say, it's interesting, given the current climate, it's kind of petered off a little bit. It's a little bit quieter now, but about 6 months ago, we were having this whole DE&I conversation about revamping DE&I, what that looks like, and things of that nature. And I also think we should also talk about, like language does matter in that sense, right? And then one of those things that I will say is that the language before was, DE&I. I think we need to get a little bit more intentional. And I appreciate that you had Denise and myself and centered the Mi'kmaq and African Nova Scotian communities first. We do need to get a little more intentional with our language in that sense. I also think that language shouldn't be something that gets us stuck to move things forward. And if you heard me early on, I talked about, progression, not perfection. There's been a lot of great documents that are out there on the African Nova Scotian community. And I think if I can insert, talking about the Black Report that was released over 30 years ago. That's a great report. I think the language was great in that report, but still very little movement in terms of what has been done. And that doesn't mean that things haven't been done, but what we really need to do is move from language to actions. And it can be on paper. That's great, looks glossy and shiny, but let's move to the action piece and get some of this stuff done and work collaboratively with community. So I would say actions matter, and it's going to define what we do in the next, I would say, 20 years to 30 years in terms of really seeing those transformative changes that we're looking for the African Nova Scotian community.
Yes, action matters. Thank you, Shawn. And for our listeners, if you're not familiar, you can find out more about the Black Report. That's BLAC, Black Learners Advisory Committee, online. It is dated, but it is shocking, Shawn, just how relevant many of those recommendations remain today. It's a pretty
Absolutely,
fundamental
yes.
report.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Shawn, for this powerful conversation today and for your clarity, your courage, and your commitment to Black excellence. It's a privilege to work with you every day.
Thanks, Jill. And the last thing I would say is I guess I will leave on an African proverb, right? And you know which one I'm going to say, probably too. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Right.
Thank you, Shawn. Perfect way to end it. Thanks for listening to Rooted and Rising. Stay connected, stay curious, and NSCC, let's continue the journey together. Until next time, take care and take action.